I apologize in advance for the sunglasses, but I can't see any of you if I don't have them on. We have a rather light-hearted story in our Torah portion this week. At least it begins lightheartedly. It doesn't end very lightheartedly, unfortunately. Our Torah portion this week, Parshat Balak, contains a rather charming tale of Bilam, a Gentile prophet who is invited by the king of Moab to place a curse upon the Israelites. Now, God counsels Bilam to refuse the king's offer, but a second proposal, accompanied by distinguished royal officials and the promise of untold wealth, convinces Bilam to saddle his donkey and set forth for the land of Moab. En route, Bilam's donkey notices an angel, sword drawn, standing in their path, and turns aside 3 times. Bilam, who can't see the angel, gets pretty irate, and he beats his donkey for disobeying him. But then the donkey opens up his mouth and responds, asking his master to look at the angel standing in their way. Finally, after listening to his talking donkey, Bilam sees the angel, who promptly rebukes Bilam and instructs him to continue with his journey, but only to speak the words that God gives him once he encounters the Israelites. Thus, when Bilam arrives to curse Israel, he instead offers 7 blessings on their behalf. The first beginning with a question. How can I curse those whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce those whom Adonai has not denounced? Now, while this part of the story indeed ends happily, Bilam, unfortunately, is not yet finished. Still eager to earn the favor of the Moabite king, he devises a strategy to entice a group of Israelites to idolatry. In essence, he tries to get them to curse themselves. Bilam's eagerness to abandon the will of God in order to obey the will of the Moabite king ultimately leads to a rather untimely demise for him and earns him the contempt not just of Jewish scholars, but of Christian scholars as well, who routinely refer to him as the evil prophet. Now, anyone who's been reading the news or reading your tweets or following on Facebook, depending on how well you've got your particular feed curtailed to meet your political proclivities, has seen what evil can be wrought when we abandon our moral and ethical principles in service of the dominion of men. From the separation of nearly 2,000 children from their parents into detention centers along our borders, to the misinformation campaign launched by the United States of America to brand these poor souls as dangerous criminals, to the cynical feinting and feigning by our nation's leaders who still treat the reunification of these families as a tool for their political gain, to the shameless attempts by the mouthpieces of our government to convince us that this is all a sensible legal path towards securing our safety. We have watched as the will of men triumphed over the divine dictates of morality. Thankfully, we can at least celebrate the near unanimous protest emanating from our nation's religious leadership, as well as last week's admission by our government that we need not, in fact, separate would-be immigrant and asylum-seeking parents from their children. But if our response to these events remains limited to complaints lobbied toward the people in power who put these processes into motion and a promise to end future family separations, then we've missed the true threat posed by this harrowing chapter in our nation's history. Because a tragic tale like this one that continues to unfold at our borders requires not just leaders, it requires followers. It requires a federal immigration agent who is willing to rip a baby from her mother's breast and handcuff that same mother when she resisted arrest. It required border patrolmen who were willing to lie to parents, telling them they were taking their children for a bath, never to bring them back. It requires detention officers who are willing to gleefully mock the inconsolable cries of children calling for their parents. In short, it requires people who are willing to obey, who are willing to place the needs of the state and the will of powerful individuals above the requirements of moral conscience. It requires those ordinary souls who are willing to forget, if even just for a minute, that the people they are dealing with are human. And as Jews, we ought to know all too well what can happen when ordinary people are willing to forget, if even for a moment, that the people they're dealing with are human. Indeed, despite the advances made last week, there remains much work to be done in order to right the wrongs performed in our name. When children and parents remain separated by the give and take of our political processes, then it's our duty to put an end to the politics that keep families apart. When the officers of our country and their distinguished officials attempt to persuade us with the voice of sweet reasonableness and fear-mongering that it's somehow better to vilify our fellow human beings in search of a safe home and imprison them like enemies, rather than by recognizing their plight, acknowledge our responsibilities to them, then it is our obligation to defy our country's leadership. And when the moral conscience of our countrymen fades into the long shadows cast by the authority of the state, then it's our responsibility to fortify the ethical foundations of our society and defend them with the complete strength of our will. Now, I understand there are those who will bemoan this discussion because politics can be very divisive. And so we don't talk about politics at Temple. And I don't talk about politics at Temple either, because this is not a matter of politics. Our texts are very clear on that. Rather, this is a matter of our sacred obligation to treat the foreigner with dignity and compassion, as commanded no fewer than 36 times in our Torah. You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the feelings of a stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. The stranger who lives among you shall be to you as one of your citizens. You shall love the stranger as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall have one law, the same for the foreigner and for the citizen. I am Adonai your God. You shall love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I could go on, but I think 5 out of the 36 suffice in this particular case. Indeed, the prophet Bilam set out to curse our people because he valued the favor of the Moabite king above the will of God. As it turns out, we now stand at the same precipice. Will we, like Bilam, place the will of the state above our sacred values? Or will we remain true to our faith by placing our loyalty to God, to our values, to our humanity, above our loyalty to the state or to a particular political persuasion? This house has always been and remains a house of prayer for all peoples, liberal and conservative, fervent and disinterested, Democrat and Republican. But if we refuse to allow our Judaism to remind us of our sacred obligations to the stranger, simply because some political leader would disagree, then Judaism is a farce, and this place is just a country club. And if empathy is not enough to move us, if our tradition's adjuration is not enough to rouse us, then at the very least, self-preservation should inspire us to put an end to these crimes against our fellow human beings. Because I guarantee you, if it can happen to asylum seekers and would-be immigrants, it can happen to us too. Now, don't get me wrong. I, more than anyone, realize that we all want to be loyal Americans. And whether you support the administration or you loathe it, I know that you're doing so out of a deep love for this great country. But sometimes the best way to support our country, sometimes the best way to support our administration, is to tell our representatives when they're wrong and to demand accountability for the steps they take on our behalf. I would never tell anyone to stop backing the president. I would never tell anyone who to vote for or even what immigration policy to support. I would just ask that we, as a Jewish community, publicly acknowledge the heinousness of the crimes that have been committed in our name and pledge every fiber of our being towards putting an end to the needless suffering and shame that our country, the United States of America, has brought upon our fellow human beings. We need to write every representative. We need to attend every march. We need to support every resistance effort. And we need to ask every friend, just as Balaam did, how can we curse those whom God has not cursed? How can we denounce those whom Adonai has not denounced? Once we've done that, once we've ended the pointless pain and unfounded allegations that have been piled upon people whose only crime was to search for a better home, once we've fulfilled our divine responsibility to the stranger, only then should the will of men govern our loyalties. Only then should we allow the politicians to decide what happens next. And only then shall we be worthy of the name Israel and all the blessings it affords. Shabbat Shalom.